The Pacific holds its winter secrets well. On the night of November 28, 1944, the sea lay almost motionless beneath a pale half-moon, its surface rippled only by swells that rose and fell with ancient rhythm. The war raging across continents seemed impossibly distant from these waters, where only wind whispered across the darkened waves. To any observer on the surface, the night appeared serene, almost untouched by human conflict. Yet beneath that tranquil facade, death was ascending toward an appointment with destiny. The submarine USS Archerfish had been idling through these waters for days, originally stationed to rescue downed American pilots from bombing raids that weather had ultimately canceled. Now liberated from that passive duty, she prowled the offshore approaches to Japan's heartland, hunting for whatever prey the darkness might reveal. Her hull, 311 feet of welded steel painted in muted gray, cut through the water with minimal disturbance. When she surfaced to charge her batteries and refresh her air, only her conning tower broke the moonlit surface, a shadow among shadows. Below, in spaces thick with the mingled odors of oil, salt, machinery, and human sweat, her crew moved with practiced quietness through a maze of valves and gauges. These men had been at war for years. They understood that vigilance meant survival. Commander Joseph F. Enright stood at the center of this silent world. At 33 years old, he carried the weight of a man who had tasted failure and emerged determined never to repeat it. His previous command had ended in humiliation when he returned from patrol without firing a single torpedo, unable to overcome his own hesitation at the critical moment. Such a patrol was not merely disappointing to a submarine officer. It was a stain on his record, a question mark about his judgment under pressure. Enright had requested relief from command, believing his instincts had betrayed him. That dark chapter had taught him something vital. He would not hesitate again. He would trust his judgment absolutely. He would strike when opportunity presented itself. Tonight, those lessons would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. At 8,048 in the evening, the radar operator's voice cut through the quiet of the control room. Contact bearing 020, range 12 miles. The blip on the screen was substantial, steady, moving southwest at approximately 20 knots. No ordinary merchant vessel would travel at such speed with such apparent confidence. Enright moved to the bridge, raising his binoculars toward the horizon. There, barely visible against the night sky, he could discern a massive silhouette accompanied by smaller shapes that could only be escorts, a major warship. His pulse quickened with the certainty of a hunter who has spotted prey beyond his expectations. The chase that followed would test every skill Enright and his crew possessed. The target maintained a speed of 20 knots, 1 knot faster than Archerfish could sustain. Yet the submarine possessed one crucial advantage: the ability to cut corners, while the larger vessel followed a predetermined zigzag pattern designed to evade submarine attack. For the next several hours, the ancient game of naval pursuit played out in the darkness. Archerfish would gain ground on the turns, lose it on the straightaways, always maintaining contact through radar and sonar. Enright calculated bearing and distance with the precision of a man playing three-dimensional chess against an opponent he could not see. What Enright did not yet know was that he was pursuing the most ambitious naval project in human history. The ship before him was Shinano, and at 71, 80, 90 tons fully loaded, she represented something unprecedented, the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever constructed. Her story had begun years earlier, born from the ashes of Japan's catastrophic losses at Midway in June 1942. The Shinano had originated as the third of the great Yamato-class battleships, conceived when Japan still believed it could match American industrial capacity through superior design and craftsmanship. The first two of her class, Yamato and Musashi, had been completed as the most heavily armed battleships ever to float. Each mounted 9 18-1-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds at targets more than 25 miles distant. They were floating fortresses, thick with armor, bristling with defensive armament. They represented the apex of Japanese naval engineering and the ultimate expression of the battleship age. But Midway had changed everything. When 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost in a single day, along with hundreds of irreplaceable experienced pilots, the strategic calculus of naval warfare shifted fundamentally. Aircraft, not battleships, would determine the outcome of any future naval engagement. Japanese naval planners recognized this truth with painful clarity. The partially constructed hull of Shinano, still in the early stages of building at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, could be converted into something far more valuable than another battleship. She could become a carrier, and not just any carrier, but a vessel so massive and so heavily armored that she could operate independently, repair damaged aircraft, and serve as a floating reserve of air power. The conversion was revolutionary. Shipyard workers labored for more than 2 years, transforming the battleship hull into something entirely new. They constructed an 840-foot flight deck above the main hull, installed massive aircraft elevators, created a cavernous hangar deck that could accommodate nearly 50 aircraft with storage for 70 more. The armor scheme, originally designed to resist massive naval gunfire, was reconfigured to protect against air attack. An armored flight deck could withstand 1,000-pound bombs. Armored belt sections up to 8 inches thick protected the waterline. 16 5-inch guns, over 105mm anti-aircraft weapons, and 12 28-barrel rocket launchers created a defensive armament that should have rendered her nearly impervious to air attack. Yet the very speed demanded by military necessity undermined the quality of her construction. The workers who built her were no longer the master craftsmen who had constructed Yamato and Musashi. Many skilled shipbuilders had been conscripted into military service. Their replacements were conscripts, students, even prisoners. Quality control, once the pride of Japanese shipbuilding, deteriorated under the relentless pressure to meet deadlines. Welds that should have been X-rayed were merely inspected visually. Tolerances grew slack. Electrical systems, dependent on materials now impossible to obtain, were improvised with inferior substitutes. The pressure to complete her by November 1944 drove workers to the edge of human endurance. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were immediately replaced. In summer, the heat inside the covered building dock where she was constructed became stifling. Accidents multiplied, deaths were hushed, and the work continued. The very launch of Shinano presaged the disaster to come. On October 8, 1944, as workers prepared to float her from dry dock for the first time, the massive gate sealing the dock from Tokyo Bay collapsed under the crushing pressure of water. Instead of a controlled flooding, a torrent burst inward with catastrophic force. Shinano surged forward like a cork ejected from a bottle, her 70,000 tons of steel driven by hydraulic violence. She crashed into the far wall of the dock with a grinding impact that shook the earth and shattered windows a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables thick as a man's arm snapped like threads, their whipping ends decapitating workers and crushing others against machinery. When the chaos finally subsided, 17 workers lay dead and 43 were injured. To the Japanese sailors and workers who witnessed it, the violent, uncontrolled launch was an omen of the worst kind. The kami, the spirits that inhabited all things in Japanese belief, had rejected this ship. She was cursed from her very conception. The repairs from the launch disaster consumed precious time. The commissioning, when it finally came on November 11, 1944, was a subdued affair. Captain Toshio Abe, her commanding officer, was a stern, practical man who had survived the Battle of Midway. He dismissed talk of curses as superstition unworthy of professional sailors. Yet even as he spoke these words, he could see doubt lingering in his men's eyes. The list of deficiencies he compiled ran to 17 pages. Of 12 boilers, only 8 were operational, reducing her designed maximum speed of 27 knots to barely 20. Her radar systems were only partially functional. Half her anti-aircraft guns lacked adequate ammunition. Most critically, many of the watertight doors that should seal off flooded compartments had never been tested under pressure. When Abe submitted this list to Naval Headquarters requesting a delay in sailing, the response was swift and absolute. Shinano would sail as scheduled. The Navy needed her to sail. Word of her existence was spreading. She needed to be seen as a symbol of strength, not discovered as a bombed wreck in her dock. The crew assembled for Shinano reflected the desperation of Japan's military situation in late 1944. Normally, a carrier's complement would train together for months before deployment, drilling damage control procedures until they became instinctive. But Shinano's crew was assembled from wherever men could be found. Veterans from sunken ships, new recruits fresh from training, even civilians conscripted into military service. Many didn't even speak the same regional dialects of Japanese. Officers attempted to conduct drills, but time was too short and confusion too common. Men got lost in the maze of passages. Equipment was in the wrong places. Orders were misunderstood. When they practiced damage control, the inadequacy of their preparation became embarrassingly apparent. The night of November 28, 1944 arrived with deceptive calm. At 6:00 p.m., Shinano's mooring lines were cast off. Tugs nudged her massive bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn, and for the first time under her own power, she moved toward the open sea. 3 destroyers, Isakaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, took up screening positions around her. Together, the 4 ships headed for the harbor entrance. As they passed through the submarine nets protecting the harbor, several crew members noticed what many took as a final bad omen, a dead albatross floating in the water, its white wings spread as if in surrender. 30 miles to the south, Archerfish's radar operator detected the contact that would change everything. The hunt began in earnest. Shinano was steaming at 20 knots, but Archerfish's maximum surface speed was only 19. The mathematics seemed impossible. How could the submarine catch prey faster than itself? The answer lay in geometry and patience. Shinano followed a standard anti-submarine zigzag pattern, her course constantly changing to avoid presenting a predictable target. Each turn cost her distance. By cutting the corners of Shinano's course changes, Archerfish could maintain contact and gradually close the distance. On Shinano's bridge, Captain Abe received reports that a submarine had been detected. He faced an immediate tactical dilemma. If he ordered his destroyers to pursue and attack the submarine, they would leave his ship exposed to other boats that might be lurking in the darkness. American submarines often operated in coordinated groups, with one boat revealing itself to draw off escorts, while others moved in for the kill. If he kept the destroyers close, he reduced the submarine's offensive options, but also accepted that she would shadow him and potentially radio his position to other boats or aircraft. Abe chose the middle course. He would maintain his zigzag pattern and use speed and evasive maneuvers to shake off pursuit. But almost immediately, Shinano's incomplete construction began to betray her. At 11:00 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft began to overheat. The massive shaft, turning at high speed, generated friction that the bearing could not properly dissipate. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone. The engineering officer faced an impossible choice: continue running and risk catastrophic mechanical failure, or reduce speed and potentially fall prey to the submarine. He reduced power on that shaft. Shinano's speed dropped from 20 knots to 18. The reduction seemed minor, but it was decisive. Now Archerfish could not merely maintain pace, but actually gain ground. In the submarine's control room, the sonar operator reported the change in the target's engine sound. "She's slowing," came the announcement. Enright permitted himself a tight smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted decisively in his favor, but Shinano's troubles multiplied with each passing hour. The rapid zigzagging, combined with her incomplete construction, stressed systems throughout the ship in ways they had never been tested. Electrical connections hastily installed began to fail. Lights flickered in compartments. Ventilation fans stopped. Temperatures in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became dangerous. Men working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. More seriously, the constant course changes caused the ship to flex and roll in ways her hastily welded seams could not withstand. Water began to seep into lower compartments. Several pumps that should have handled this routine maintenance failed immediately. They had never been properly tested under actual operating conditions, and now their defects became apparent. By 2:00 m. on November 29th, Archerfish had closed to within 7,000 yards of her target. Still too far for a reliable torpedo attack, but close enough to maintain solid contact. The submarine's crew was exhausted but exhilarated. They could sense they were gaining on their enormous prey. Enright studied the tracking data with intense concentration. Despite the zigzags, Shinano consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees southwest toward her destination at Kure. If he could position Archerfish ahead of that track, if he could predict when she would steady on that course, he would have his shot. "Take her down to radar depth," Enright ordered. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, leaving only her radar antenna above water. This reduced her speed, but made her far harder to spot. Now she was truly invisible, watching, but unseen. At 2056 a.m., the lead destroyer Isokazi's lookouts spotted what they believed was a periscope off the starboard bow. Without waiting for orders, her captain increased speed to 35 knots and charged toward the contact. The destroyer's bow wave rose white in the darkness as she accelerated. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice rose in alarm. "High-speed screws approaching. Destroyer bearing 340 degrees, closing fast." Enright had perhaps 5 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether his hunt ended in triumph or disaster. Crash dive and certainly lose his target forever, or hold his depth and risk detection. He chose to dive, but only to 150 feet shallow enough to resurface quickly if the threat passed. "Rig for silent running," he ordered. "Rig for depth charge." The destroyer passed directly overhead, her screws thundering through the water. Every man on Archerfish held his breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges, but none came. Isokazi had lost contact. More importantly, she had violated Captain Abe's orders to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge ordered her back into position. The moment Isokazi turned away, Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano was still there, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had pursued all night was at hand. At 3015 a.m., everything aligned perfectly. Shinano steadied on her base course of 200 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish, range 400 yards. Speed 16 knots. In submarine warfare, it was the perfect setup. Close enough for accuracy, angled for maximum target area, slow enough for a good solution. Enright made his final observations through the periscope. The carrier filled his view beyond anything he had ever seen. Her flight deck stretched like a cliff face. Her island structure rose like a building. He could see lights in some of her portholes, the shadows of her escorts, the white water at her bow. He sketched quickly, recording her strange rounded bow, unlike any carrier in the recognition manuals. "Final bearing and shoot," he ordered. Make ready all tubes." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were ready. These weapons had been troublesome earlier in the war with defective detonators and running depths, but those problems had been corrected. Now they were reliable ship killers, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. "Set depth 10 feet, Enright ordered. It was unusually shallow, but he had been advised that carriers hit high on the hull would suffer damage affecting stability, not merely flooding. The fire control party made their final calculations. Target speed, angle, distance, all were fed into the torpedo data computer. The solution was checked and double-checked. There would be no second chance. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube, ejected by compressed air. It came to life immediately, its propellers spinning, driving it toward the target at 46 knots. 8 seconds between shots, allowing each torpedo time to clear before the next launched. Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 death sentences were racing through the water toward Shinano. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal, exactly as designed. Their wakes, barely visible in the darkness, drew straight lines toward the carrier's hull. On Shinano's bridge, lookouts spotted the wakes too late. "Torpedoes starboard!" came the cry. Captain Abe ordered full rudder, but the carrier's massive bulk responded slowly. She had barely begun her turn when the first torpedo struck. The explosion was tremendous. A column of water shot up alongside the hull, higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to port from the impact. Before the crew could react, the second torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all on the starboard side, all between the bow and the island structure. The first torpedo struck at frame 104 near an aviation fuel tank that was fortunately empty. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet wide in the hull, flooding adjacent compartments instantly. The second hit frame 42, destroying the starboard outboard engine room. Men on duty there were killed instantly as seawater and superheated steam filled the space. The third torpedo struck frame 166, opening the number 3 fire room to the sea. The fourth hit frame 190, rupturing another fuel tank and sending oil flooding through passages. For a moment, those on Shinano's bridge could barely comprehend what had happened. The ship shuddered with each impact, but she was so large that the torpedoes seemed almost insignificant. Captain Abe's first instinct was that she could absorb this damage. After all, she had been built with a battleship's armor designed to survive multiple torpedo hits. But below decks, catastrophe was unfolding. The incomplete construction that had plagued Shinano now became fatal. Watertight doors that had never been tested failed immediately. Some jammed shut, trapping men in flooding compartments. Others refused to close at all. Seams that had been hastily welded split open under pressure. Electrical panels soaked with seawater short-circuited in showers of sparks. The damage control teams responded as best they could, but they were fighting a losing battle. The men had never drilled together as a unit. Orders were confused and contradictory. Some teams rushed to flood counterbalancing compartments on the port side to correct the list. Others tried to pump out flooded areas. The two efforts worked against each other. The list increased steadily, 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. On the flight deck, aircraft and equipment began to slide. Sailors formed human chains, trying to secure loose items, but it was futile. A fuel truck broke free and crashed into the island structure. Boxes of ammunition tumbled into the sea. Captain Abe maintained rigid composure on the bridge. He ordered counter-flooding to correct the list. He set course for the nearest land, hoping to beach the ship. He dispatched messages to Naval headquarters. But even as he gave these orders, he must have known the truth. The reports from below were uniformly grim. Flooding was out of control. The pumps couldn't keep pace. Half the crew didn't know their damage control stations. The ship was dying. Back on Archerfish, Enright had taken the submarine deep immediately after firing. Now came the most dangerous moment for any submarine, the counterattack. Above them, Japanese destroyers were racing back and forth, their sonar pinging, their crews preparing depth charges. At 400 feet, Enright ordered silent running. Every man aboard silent, breathing shallowly. They could hear the destroyers above, the high-speed whine of screws, the ping of active sonar, the splash of depth charges entering the water. The first pattern exploded, 5 charges detonating in sequence. The submarine shook, light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained from the overhead. But the explosions were distant, at least 500 yards away. The Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, couldn't get a precise fix on the submarine. More charges followed, 14 in total. Each explosion sent shock waves through the water, rattling the submarine, but none were close enough to cause serious damage. After an hour, the sounds above grew distant. The destroyers had given up the hunt and returned to their dying charge. As dawn broke on November 29th, Shinano was in her death throes. The list had increased to 20 degrees. Walking on the tilted decks had become impossible. Men used ropes to pull themselves up the slanted surfaces. In the hangar deck, the Oka suicide planes had broken loose, sliding into each other, their volatile rocket fuel creating an extreme fire hazard. The flooding had spread far beyond the initial torpedo damage in what naval architects called progressive flooding. Water found paths through doors, vents, and cable runs, spreading like cancer through the ship. At 8:03 a.m., Captain Abe authorized the emergency signal, "Prepare to abandon ship." It was not yet an order to abandon, but a warning to be ready. Sailors began gathering on the flight deck, helping wounded comrades up from below. Life jackets were distributed. The destroyers moved in closer, preparing to pick up survivors. Below decks, scenes of heroism and tragedy played out simultaneously. Engineers remained at their posts, keeping the lights on and the pumps running until water drove them out. Medical officers worked in tilting sick bays, trying to evacuate patients. In one flooded compartment, 30 men were trapped behind a jammed hatch. Their hammering could be heard for an hour before it stopped. The end came with shocking suddenness. At 10:18 a.m., the list suddenly increased to 35 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and men began sliding uncontrollably down the flight deck into the sea. The order came, all hands abandon ship. But for many, it was too late. The list increased so rapidly that hundreds were trapped inside. Others, trying to climb the tilted deck, lost their grip and fell. Some jumped from the flight deck, a 60-foot drop that killed many on impact. Captain Abe remained on the bridge. As was tradition, he would go down with his ship. He tied himself to the helm, determined to maintain dignity to the end. Around him, his senior officers made the same choice. They sang the national anthem as the water rose around them. At 10:05 a.m., Shinano capsized. Her flight deck tilted past vertical. Then she rolled completely over. For a moment, her massive hull was visible, barnacles and red anti-fouling paint gleaming in the morning sun. Then, with a tremendous roar of escaping air, she plunged beneath the surface. The largest warship in the world had survived just 17 hours at sea. The sea where Shinano sank was littered with debris and desperate men. Over 2,000 had been aboard. Now hundreds struggled in the oil-slicked water. The 3 destroyers moved among them, picking up survivors. But the rescue was selective. Naval tradition held that officers should be saved first. Some destroyer captains, hardened by war, refused to pick up men who showed panic. When the rescue ended, 1,080 men had been saved. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were dead. It was one of the largest losses of life in a single ship sinking during the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic, but had to be hidden. Shinano had been a state secret. Her loss would remain one. Survivors were sworn to secrecy. Families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had died in action, not where or how. The official records were sealed. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed, but secrets are hard to keep in war. American codebreakers reading intercepted messages learned of the sinking within days. The name Shinano appeared in decoded traffic along with her position when torpedoed. Intelligence officers were puzzled. They had no record of a ship by that name. What had Archerfish sunk? When Enright filed his patrol report in December, claiming to have sunk a carrier of unprecedented size, he was met with skepticism. Navy intelligence insisted no such carrier existed. The highest they would credit him with was a 28,000-ton carrier, still significant but far short of reality. Only after the war, when American investigators gained access to Japanese records, was the truth revealed. Shinano had displaced 71 80-90 tons fully loaded. She was indeed the largest carrier ever built, and remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The story of Shinano's single voyage carries lessons that transcend the specific events of November 1944. It is a tale of hubris and humility, of grand ambitions undone by fundamental flaws, of how the smallest predator can fell the mightiest prey if conditions align. For Japan, Shinano represented the failure of the decisive weapon philosophy. Throughout the war, Japanese strategists had sought single war-winning weapons, super battleships, divine wind attacks, miraculous carriers. But wars are won by systems, not symbols. While Japan built one massive carrier, America built dozens of smaller ones. While Japan rushed incomplete ships to sea, America took time to train crews properly. The result was inevitable. The technical lessons were equally clear. Size without reliability is vulnerability. Armor without proper damage control is false security. A ship's strength lies not just in steel, but in the training of her crew, the quality of her construction, the integrity of every weld and seal. Shinano failed, not because her design was flawed, but because her execution was incomplete. For the submarine force, the sinking validated their war of attrition. Submarines, relatively cheap and crewed by fewer than 100 men, could destroy capital ships worth thousands of times their cost. The silent service had proven it could strike anywhere, anytime, against any target. The age of the submarine as a strategic weapon had truly arrived. Commander Enright's personal journey from failure to redemption resonated throughout the Navy. His story showed that one failure need not define a career, that persistence and courage could overcome past mistakes. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. The Navy Cross he received was not just for sinking Shinano, but for the determination to stay in the fight after earlier defeats. The human cost haunts the story. Over 400 Japanese sailors died, many of them conscripts who had never wanted to go to war. They died trapped in flooding compartments, thrown from tilting decks, or abandoned in cold water. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. Shinano never launched a plane in anger, never defended the homeland, never justified the resources spent on her construction. Today, Shinano rests in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omazaki. She lies upside down, her flight deck buried in sediment, her hull slowly collapsing under the pressure of depth and time. She is a tomb for the men who died with her, and a monument to the age when nations believed that bigger meant better, that one perfect weapon could change everything. Modern naval strategists study Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an age of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain relevant. Complexity requires competence. Size demands support. No ship, no matter how powerful, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates it. The sinking also demonstrates the role of chance in war. Had Shinano sailed a day earlier or later, had Archerfish been assigned elsewhere, had the torpedoes run deep instead of shallow, history would be different. War is not just strategy and technology, but also luck and timing. On that November night in 1944, all the variables aligned perfectly for Archerfish and catastrophically for Shinano. In the years after the war, the story of Shinano and Archerfish became legend in naval circles. Authors wrote books. Historians analyzed the engagement. Veterans shared their memories. Each telling added details and corrected errors, building the narrative we know today. Commander Enright went on to a successful naval career, retiring as a rear admiral. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking, maintaining the quiet professionalism of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would say simply, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." But those who knew him understood that it meant everything. The vindication of his courage, the proof that he belonged in command, the second chance that he had seized. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades. These aging men, who had once been young sailors, would gather and remember their moment of glory. They told stories of the long chase, the tension of the approach, the thunder of the torpedoes hitting home. But they also remembered Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time made them all simply men who had served at sea. Some survivors of Shinano also told their stories after the veil of secrecy finally lifted. They spoke of the chaos, the fear, the sight of their mighty ship rolling over and sinking. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing at attention as the water rose. They remembered comrades who had helped them escape flooding compartments, who had given up life jackets, who had pushed others to safety before being pulled under themselves. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's last phase. Grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only added to the suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than accepting defeat. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could overcome size and armor. It was David and Goliath written in steel and torpedoes, proof that in war, the smallest unit could achieve strategic victory. The wreck of Shinano was discovered in 2019 by deep-sea explorers. The images they brought back showed a ship remarkably intact, despite decades underwater. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted the pressure that would have crushed lesser vessels. But she lies inverted, her intended glory forever buried in the seafloor, a monument to ambition that exceeded capability. Today, as nations again compete to build the largest, most powerful warships, Shinano's story remains relevant. Technology advances, but the human factors that doomed her persist. Ships are still built in haste, crews still sail with insufficient training, leaders still believe that one supreme weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano warns against such hubris. The final lesson may be the most universal. In war, as in life, the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Sometimes patience defeats power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Sometimes a single night's action can echo through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the thin margin between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built. The other was a standard submarine of no special distinction. When the sun rose, only one remained. That is the nature of war at sea, sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean shows no favoritism to size or strength. It swallows all equally, keeping its secrets in the dark depths where Shinano rests still, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a giant felled by a predator she never truly saw.